Welcome to Here's Why, a show where I cover some of Yu-Gi-Oh's hottest takes and most burning questions, like should Pot of Greed be unbanned? Are floodgates even good? And more. In each episode, we'll explore both sides of the topic and at the end determine which is right and which is wrong. This is Here's Why. What's up, Ocean? You got Matt here, and welcome to the first episode of Here's Why. You heard the intro, we're going to be talking about anything Yu-Gi-Oh related. No topic is off limit, and today's topic is hand traps. Are they good? Are they bad? Let's find out. But first, if you're excited for the video and for the Here's Why series, then make sure to smash the like button. Also, if you like competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, including deck profiles, guides on how to beat the best decks, meta discussions, and videos just like this one, you're gonna love this channel. So make sure to subscribe. But with that being said, here is episode number 1 of Here's Why. Let's jump into it. So I've been really into competitive Yu-Gi-Oh for about a year and a half, 2 years now. But I did play casually when I was a kid before Synchros came out, and when I did come back to the game, one of the biggest adjustments I had to make, other than learning the extra deck mechanics, was hand traps. At first, I thought, oh my god, you're stopping my turn 1 dinosaur combo with a single copy of Ash Blossom, that is insane, but I got over that pretty quickly. But since I started making Yu-Gi-Oh videos, I can't tell you how often I hear that hand traps are killing the game and we should ban them all. Now, I've never actually given that idea too much thought before, but that did lead me to wanting to make this video and exploring it a bit further. So what are the pros and cons of hand traps staying or being Thanos snapped out of existence? What would Yu-Gi-Oh have to do to adjust, and can we find a balance of cards that can exist in the game without hand traps being around either? And of course, would we as Yu-Gi-Oh players be better off in a world without hand traps? Now, I have to say it, but this isn't a video that's meant to hate on Yu-Gi-Oh at all. It's more so just meant to help start a discussion, and that's really it. So with that being said, let's get started with our first side of the argument. So the main argument I'm hearing about hand traps being good for the game is mostly based on the fact that Yu-Gi-Oh is such a fast game and hand traps give you, the player, a chance to play when you're going second. This is totally true. Yu-Gi-Oh is a very fast-paced game compared to the others in the big three. Pokemon has energy, Magic has mana, it takes time to accumulate all these resources and make a push. Compared to Yu-Gi-Oh, where you can just play a card and your cost to play that card is going to be maybe discarding a card, paying a couple life points, or at the worst case, oh my god, you target a card on the field, it really becomes tough to just say what is going to be the cost or downside to activating a card or effect. Hand traps are here to help counter that, because without hand traps, a lot of the time turns just become solitaire, where you're playing on your own for 10, 15, 20 minutes of your long combo, and then you pass turn to your opponent with an unbreakable board. Some hand traps can be really annoying for certain strategies and not matter too much for others. But honestly, most decks in the format today have 1 or 2 cards that they really want to have resolved to promote their game plan. If you can negate that effect, then it's going to really make their end board significantly weaker. For example, if your opponent activates the effect of Snake Eyes Flamber's Dragon to summon back 2 level 1 fire monsters from the graveyard and you hit that with a Ghost Spell, that's a huge power push and gives you a massive advantage in the rest of the game. The issue is because individual Yu-Gi-Oh cards are so strong and require so much attention for almost every single one of them, at least in top meta decks, you have to play a critical mass of hand traps to hope that you see them in your opening hand to stop your opponent. The trade-off with playing more hand traps is you can open up hands that have a lot of hand traps but no ways to actually start your own combo, which can be very frustrating. On top of that, most hand traps in the game today are hard once per turn. Think of Ash Blossom, Ghost Bell, and Nibiru. You can only use 1 per turn, which really hurts your chances of winning a game if you see multiple in your opening hand. Also, not all hand traps are good all the time. Sure, there are more generic hand traps like Ash Blossom and Infinite Impermanence, which are good almost every format, but that's because most decks in the game today do a lot of special summoning from the deck, sending from deck to graveyard, adding from deck to hand, or have really powerful on-field effects that are weak to Infinite Impermanence. But even these 2 powerful hand traps have some decks where their matchups and power level is a lot weaker than against others. For example, some decks are able to play around Ash Blossom. Instead of adding cards to hand, they activate them or set them directly from the deck. Or some cards as well that would be weak to Imperm normally aren't actually that weak to it because the deck is inherently able to remove them from the field. And of course, there are going to be some really busted hand traps like Nibiru or Dimension Shifter, even Droll and Lockbird, which are all really powerful, but they're meant to keep the game in check. Hand traps are so important because they're meant to keep up with power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh! Konami can't just create a brand new hand trap whenever a new archetype comes out that would directly counter that specific strategy. It just doesn't make sense. Hand traps have to be strong enough to keep up with the constant power creep we see in Yu-Gi-Oh, or else we'll have so many more hand traps than we do right now, and they'll all be more problematic than the last. And one of the more important reasons as to why hand traps are good is that Yu-Gi-Oh would be so dice roll dependent to find out who wins. If hand traps didn't exist, most of the time you would see players roll a dice and then whoever has the higher number wins the game. As annoying as they can be, hand traps actually help promote a healthier interactive gameplay than otherwise would be the case. But what about the alternatives? Why are hand traps actually bad? Everything I've said about hand traps already is true, but it's also very true that if you open up with no hand traps and your opponent opens up with a bunch of hand traps plus their 1 card or 2 card starters, they're able to go ahead and just pop off, make their full combo, have a scary end board, and have the power of hand traps to back themselves up, which can be extremely annoying for you to deal with as a player and just end the game in an instant. Hand traps are bad for Yu-Gi-Oh because they also stop rogue decks from being able to compete at a higher level. There's a reason why some decks are really good and why others aren't able to consistently compete with these strategies, and most of the time it's going to be how well do they play through interruption and how consistent are they actually going to be. If you're playing a deck that needs to resolve one specific effect to pop off well, and that card gets hand trapped with an Imperm, a Veiler, Ash Blossom, whatever the case might be, then it makes it really hard for you to play that deck in almost any format, because these cards are being used to stop the better decks and they just so happen to stop your deck as well. And instead of needing multiple hand traps to stop decks like Snake Eye or Fire King, they only need 1 to beat yours, and that can be really annoying if you're a rogue player. Hand traps are also so incredibly generic and they really restrict deck building because of how much they warp the format. Think of a format like Master Duel. Pretty much every single deck starts off with the maximum number of copies you can play of Maxi, Ash Blossom, Called By, and Crossout. All of those cards are used to be able to beat Maxi and be able to resolve Maxi against your opponents. With that being the case, it makes almost every deck in the format look pretty much identical, but it's not just in Master Duel, it's also in the TCG. For example, Snake Eyes, which is the best deck in the format today, can play 20 different hand traps in their strategy, and a lot of the time they're the same 20 hand traps as the person next to them is playing as well. It's going to be 3 Ash, 3 Imperm, 3 Veiler, 3 Nib, you're going to see Drolls in the side deck, you're going to see Ghost Mourners as well if they want to go that route. There are so many other great cards they can play, but almost every deck starts off by putting in 15 different hand traps that are the exact same as the person next to them. Personally, that doesn't really bother me, but when I was first playing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, one of the most annoying things about hand traps for me was that the fact that they are hidden and you had no idea if your opponent actually had them or not. For a long time, Yu-Gi-Oh was about figuring out what your opponents had on field with their monsters and their back row cards and finding out if you can play through it or break the board enough to be able to play your strategy too. Since hand traps came out, your opponent can set a bunch of cards as long as they have 1 card in your hand. That 1 card can be the end of your entire turn. Unless they have no cards in hand or you've seen their hand with something like triple tactic talents, you have no way of knowing if they actually have a hand trap or not, which is incredibly frustrating. I can't even count the amount of times that I've looked at my opponent's board full of negates and said, you know what, I can play through this as long as they don't have 1 specific hand trap. And then I can just proceed to my combo, I start playing through it, and they activate that 1 hand trap, and my entire chance of playing through their board is ruined. The fact that hand traps are hidden information is a little annoying, I'm not gonna lie, but the counterpoint to that would be setting a bluff back row. Setting a normal spell card face down to make your opponent think they maybe have to worry about an infinite impermanence or a counter trap card is a really important part about Yu-Gi-Oh! That information is hidden just like a hand trap would be, and even though it's a bluff, your opponent still has to worry about that mystery card. There are so many different reasons as to why people don't like hand traps or think they're bad for Yu-Gi-Oh! But one of the most common ones that I've heard is that people don't like hand traps because Yu-Gi-Oh! Makes them feel like they have to play them to have any chance of winning a game. Now I completely get that. Imagine you're playing against someone who's on Dark World, for example, and their goal is to rip out all the cards from your hand and make it so you can't play the game. You sit down, you lose the die roll, they go first, you have no hand traps, they proceed to go for a 15, 20, 25 minute long combo to get rid of all the cards in your hand, and there's nothing you can do against that. That is incredibly frustrating. But as frustrating as that is, I think there is a possibility that we can have a game that doesn't need hand traps to have a lot of fun. But to do that, Yu-Gi-Oh! Would have to change pretty drastically. We would have to have more restrictions on special summoning and more difficult effects to resolve, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters in general just can't be as individually powerful as they are right now. But we all know that's not actually going to happen. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is an incredibly high-powered game, and most decks have a very high ceiling as well. But instead of lowering the ceiling or the power level of these strategies, they incorporate hand traps to make it so that they can still print powerful decks because we have ways to stop them as well. Now, if hand traps did get erased from the game entirely, I think it's very possible we see a lot of even better going second cards to combat these powerful end boards we get in Yu-Gi-Oh! Today. Imagine if we had a very basic archetype that had two effects. The first one could be something like a Stratos or a Foolish Burial or whatever the case might be. But the second would be that if your opponent responds to this card or negates this card, you could special summon something from the extra deck or from the main deck or add a card from deck to hand or whatever the case might be. Something like that could be really cool to be able to interact with other cards in the game today. But I don't think we can ever really get to a point where we can have an archetype that can do those kinds of things in a format where hand traps exist. After taking the time to go through both sides of the argument, do I actually believe that hand traps are bad? Not at all. Hand traps are very format dependent. In some formats they can be really strong, but in others they can be incredibly weak. There are some hand traps like Ash Blossom or Infinite Impermanence that are almost always going to be good because of what Yu-Gi-Oh! Has become. And there are others that are always going to be oppressive, cards that are really powerful and need to be accounted for almost all the time. The other question is, are hand traps bad for Yu-Gi-Oh? And again, I don't think they are. In the past 2 years, we've seen two of the strongest archetypes in the history of the game, in Tearlament and Snake Eye. When it comes to Snake Eye format, a lot of the time the games come down to, do you have enough hand traps to stop your opponent's starters, or do they have enough hand traps to stop your starters? The reason why that's the case is because each individual Snake Eye or Diabellstar card is so exceptionally powerful on its own that without a hand trap, you can lose so much advantage so quickly. And when it comes to Tearlaments, we literally got new hand traps to counter that strategy in the Bestials the set after Tearlaments were released. Now you might say that it's unhealthy for the game to just count the hand traps versus starters in a specific strategy to kind of determine the winner, or to print a new hand trap whenever a powerful archetype is released, and you would be right. But the problem isn't the hand traps. It's because of the constant power creep we're seeing to create new and better cards and archetypes every single year. Tearlament and Snake Eye are two of the strongest archetypes the game has ever seen. Players play hand traps to stop certain decks. They don't play decks to stop certain hand traps. So would we be better off with no hand traps? No, absolutely not. Hand traps are part of Yu-Gi-Oh! And the real problem is going to be that decks and cards themselves are way too powerful nowadays. If we put price aside, hand traps aren't the problem. They never really were. Except Shifter. Screw Shifter. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. Are hand traps good for Yu-Gi-Oh! Or has Yu-Gi-Oh! Been in a downward spiral ever since hand traps became so powerful? Also, while you're down there in the comments, let me know if you have a topic you want me to cover in this series. You made it to the end of the video, which means you must have enjoyed it, so make sure to smash the like button and of course subscribe to the channel for more amazing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Videos. Also follow me on Twitter and join the Discord server, both are linked in the description. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.